Dublin, Easter 1916. The second city of the kingdom, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. To the Irish, a capital city, but in 1916 a provincial capital overlaid with British institutions and customs. In the Great War, Irish men and women were serving beside the Scots, the Welsh and the English. But civilian life in Ireland went on much as usual. A race meeting was being held that Easter Monday at Fairy House, near Dublin. The crowds went light-heartedly, watched the big race, and started back home. But they didn't get home.
Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
The Irish Republicans, led by Patrick Pearse, had launched a rising against British rule. Fierce fighting had broken out. What were later to be known as the Troubles had begun. At first, the British authorities were taken by surprise. Their forces suffered more than 400 casualties. But they brought up reinforcements and bombarded the rebel positions with artillery. Within a week, the rising was over, and the rebels were dead or had surrendered. There was little sympathy with the prisoners, who were actually hissed by the Dublin crowd as they were marched away to prison. To most Irishmen, the rising had been foolish. To those who had sons or brothers fighting in Flanders, it was worse: treachery. But then, courts-martial were held. In twos and threes, the rebel leaders were sentenced to die and executed by firing squads. The executions horrified the Irish, even those who, like the poet A.E., had condemned the rising itself.
Here's to you, Pearse, your dream, not mine. And yet the thought, for this you died, has turned life's water into wine.
The men who died were little known. Pearse was a schoolmaster. Thomas MacDonagh, a poet, told his judges, "There is always a chance of success for brave men who challenge fortune." The swashbuckling John MacBride had fought against England once before with the Boers in South Africa. The socialist, James Connolly, had been badly wounded in the fighting. He was strapped to a chair and carried out to face the firing squad. The rebellion failed, but the executions were decisive. The Irish people were jolted into realizing what the Republicans had been fighting for. They remembered that Ireland had been a nation long before the English invaded. A Celtic nation with a language of her own and a distinctive culture. They remembered how, in the 18th century, the Protestant English had tried, unsuccessfully, to crush the Irish Catholic faith. They remembered the great potato famine of the 1840s, when over 1 million Irish men and women starved to death, while successive English governments did nothing. Many of them had relatives who had died in the Great Hunger, or who had survived but been forced to emigrate to America. Some stayed and tried to live off the land, but their English landlords charged rack rents and evicted those who couldn't pay. homeless, cursed England. The crown was the symbol of English domination, and the men of 1916 were seen as the successors to those who, in earlier centuries, had risen in rebellion against it, and whose risings were religiously commemorated: the United Irishmen, the Young Irelanders, and the Fenians. There had been Irish nationalists who believed that Home Rule could be won by constitutional means, and in 1914, Asquith's Home Rule Bill was actually on the statute book. But the Republicans didn't believe it would go through, and for one reason: Ulster. In the northeast corner of Ireland, the Protestant Orangemen, under Edward Carson, had pledged themselves to defend their country from popery. Home rule, said the Ulstermen, would mean Rome rule. And they armed themselves with German rifles to prevent it. The Republicans in the south formed the rival Irish Volunteers. They too equipped themselves with German arms and trained for rebellion. So did the Workers' Citizen Army. The Great War came. England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity. In 1915, at the burial of an old Fenian, O'Donovan Rossa, Pearse called for a blood sacrifice for Ireland.
Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations.
And at Easter 1916, the blood sacrifice was offered. The effect was as Pearse had hoped. When, later that year, some of the prisoners of Easter week were released, they found a very different spirit in Ireland. Under the banner Sinn Fein, ourselves alone, republicanism had become a national movement, and Ireland was becoming a nation once again. Sinn Fein began to win seats at by-elections to the British House of Commons. These election results worried Lloyd George, who'd succeeded Asquith as Prime Minister. He summoned a convention representative of every branch of Irish life. But it was the old story: too little, too late. In any case, they were no longer representative of Ireland, these men from the past. To create an atmosphere of goodwill, Lloyd George released the remaining Irish prisoners. But this brought only another wave of fervent nationalism. And an Irish welcome for the new leader, Eamon de Valera, and for another rebel who'd been under sentence of death, Countess Markievicz. Lloyd George's convention was a dismal failure. He changed his tactics. The authorities began to arrest Sinn Feiners. But one of them, Thomas Ashe, went on hunger strike and died in prison. Ashe's funeral was the occasion for another massive Sinn Fein demonstration. Michael Collins, the commander of a new guerrilla force, the Irish Republican Army, spoke in uniform at Ashe's graveside.
That volley is the only speech which it is proper to make above the grave of a dead Fenian.
As the war in France dragged on, Britain's need for more manpower became desperate. And Lloyd George decided to extend conscription to Ireland. It was a serious mistake. In the south, there was passionate opposition to the plan. The Catholic hierarchy had up to now opposed Sinn Fein, but they pledged themselves to resist conscription by every means that are consonant with the laws of God. Lloyd George had either to come to terms with nationalism or to crush it. He sent a soldier, Viscount French, to Ireland with instructions to crush it. Within a week, French rounded up 70 Sinn Fein leaders and sent them to English prisons. But at this point, the Great War ended. The peace conference at Versailles was to settle the claims to independence of several small nations. Lloyd George was too busy to bother with Ireland. Sinn Fein fought the 1918 general election and swept Ireland, all except Ulster. The new Sinn Fein MPs didn't go to Westminster. Instead, they set up a parliament of their own, Dáil Éireann, which met in the Mansion House in Dublin. Half of the members were absent in English jails, but Ireland, at last, had a legislative assembly of her own. The day the Dáil met, the shooting started. Michael Collins became the organizer of a campaign of terrorism. The IRA's targets were soldiers, policemen, and civil servants. Alan Bell, an elderly magistrate, was dragged from a Dublin tram and shot. The other passengers had seen his killers. Nobody came forward to identify them. The IRA shot informers. Collaborators received the traditional haircut. The constabulary couldn't control the increasing violence. So the British government advertised for recruits in Britain, ex-officers known as the auxiliaries, and unemployed ex-servicemen who came to be known from their makeshift uniforms as the Black and Tans. Hamar Greenwood, Chief Secretary for Ireland, was responsible for them. They were not easy men to discipline. Soon, terrorism was to be met with counter-terror.
The brave Italians who fought the Black and Tans, from Liffey, Newr and Shannon, from Lagan, Shore and Ban. All honour to those volunteers who for duty did report, but the boys who bade the Black and Tans were the boys of the County Cork.
Every volunteer is entitled legally and morally, when in the execution of his military duties, to use all legitimate methods of warfare against the soldiers and policemen of the English usurper, and to slay them, if it is necessary to do so, to overcome their resistance.
Within weeks of their arrival in Ireland, the Black and Tans were fighting back at the IRA. When the IRA attacked ammunition dumps and police barracks, Black and Tan raiding parties went out to try and bring the terrorists in. But it wasn't only terrorists who suffered. When the towns were provoked, they burned and looted almost indiscriminately. The IRA attacked the barracks at Mallow, County Cork. The towns retaliated by burning down the local creamery. Ireland was to be made a hell for rebels to live in. At Balbriggan, County Dublin, a soldier was shot. The towns, in reprisal, burned down houses and killed 2 villagers. And they made no secret of what they had done. Are we to lie down while our comrades are being shot in cold blood? We say never. Stop the shooting of police, or we will lay low every house that smells of Sinn Fein. Remember Balbriggan. By order, Black and Tans. In one village, Sinn Feiners hauled down the Union Jack on Armistice Day and hoisted the tricolour. For this insult, they were forced to parade the Union Jack. Lloyd George boasted he had murder by the throat, though to others in England his policy of reprisals and collective punishment was indefensible. Yet all this time, no one was officially at war. The Dublin social round went on. The IRA wore no uniforms. The British could never tell where their enemies were. They could never relax. Sean Tracy of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade of the IRA was caught and shot dead in Talbot Street, Dublin. But there were always other gunmen with friends and families to hide them, and the killing went on. The calendar was marked off by British military funerals. Every victim was, for the IRA, a victory, but a victory which angered British opinion, making it more difficult for Lloyd George ever to negotiate with the Republicans. The Irish had their martyrs too. Thomas McCurtain, Lord Mayor of Cork, a local commander in the IRA, had been shot in his home by a gang of masked men. The British claimed, rather improbably, that McCurtain was killed by IRA extremists because he was too much of a moderate. But the Irish jury at the inquest blamed the Royal Constabulary officially directed by the British government. The next Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSweeney, was jailed in Brixton. He went on hunger strike for 74 days before he died. MacSweeney's coffin attracted huge crowds on its way through London. The authorities forbade it to be sent to Dublin, so the Irish prepared to receive it at Cork. Terence MacSweeney's funeral was a day of public mourning in Ireland. MacSweeney's death attracted international attention, but the Irish were even more appalled when Kevin Barry, an 18-year-old student, was hanged for killing a British soldier.
In Mountjoy jail one Monday morning, high upon the gallows tree, Kevin Barry gave his young life for the cause of liberty. Another martyr for old Ireland, another murder for the crown, whose brutal laws may crush the Irish, but can't keep their spirit down.
Executions and reprisals helped De Valera, who was in the United States raising funds, pleading Ireland's cause, and denouncing England's cruelty. Hundreds of Republicans were by now prisoners, but still the IRA, with the Irish people behind them, carried on a guerrilla war.
On the 18th day of September, outside the town of Macroom, the tans in their big crossly tenders, they hurtled along to their doom. For the boys of the column was waiting, with hand grenades primed on the spot. And the Irish Republican Army, they wiped out the whole bloody lot.
18 British soldiers were killed. Then, one Sunday morning in November, 14 British Secret Service agents living in Dublin were surprised in their beds and shot dead. The bodies were taken to England for burial, bringing home to people the significance of this, the most spectacular of Michael Collins' efforts. Bloody Sunday. That afternoon, the Tans went to a football match at Croke Park to look for the assassins, and they fired on the crowd. "60 wounded were taken to hospital, 1 footballer and 11 spectators were killed. At last, in December 1920, martial law was proclaimed in those regions where the IRA was strongest. The penalty for carrying arms was now death. The auxiliaries celebrated with a raid on Cork. They looted and set fire to the shops in the main street and bayoneted the firemen's hoses to stop them putting the fires out. The damage was estimated at over £3 million. Eventually, the British officer in charge despaired of keeping his men disciplined and resigned. Lloyd George realized the jig was up. He had to face negotiations with De Valera. An English Prime Minister treat with a rebel? There was no alternative. Sinn Fein could not be suppressed. In June 1921, King George V went to Belfast. 6 counties of Ulster had by this time separated themselves from the rest of the country. He had come to open the new Northern Ireland Parliament. In his speech, he said,
"I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards the end of strife among her people, whatever their race and creed. In that hope, I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget."
Lloyd George expressed himself willing to heed the King's appeal, not surprisingly as he'd prompted it himself. In Dublin, a meeting with the Republican leaders was arranged at the Mansion House. The Dubliners welcomed what they felt sure was the beginning of the end of the War of Independence. A truce was declared. De Valera set out for London to discuss terms with Lloyd George. In Downing Street, prayers for success. But the English terms were not acceptable. Lloyd George was head of a coalition dependent on Conservative votes. He needed an Irish settlement, but most of all he wanted to stay in office. He offered Dominion Home Rule with Northern Ireland left out. De Valera wanted a republic, an all-Ireland republic at that, and he returned to Dublin determined to hold out for it. But he found everyone was enjoying the truce. British soldiers, for the first time for years, left their weapons behind when they went to the races. Nobody wanted the killing to start again. De Valera sent a team of plenipotentiaries to London, led by the founder of Sinn Fein, Arthur Griffith, and by Michael Collins. Neither of them was a doctrinaire Republican. De Valera, who was, deliberately stayed behind. Again, Lloyd George offered independence, but no more concessions. Northern Ireland must be allowed to remain separate. The Irish Free State must remain nominally under the Crown. After days of deadlock, Lloyd George issued an ultimatum: sign the terms or face immediate war. Griffith and Collins settled for what they could get and signed. In England, relief. The settlement was welcomed, except by die-hard conservatives who denounced it as a surrender to force and a betrayal of the empire. In Ireland, general rejoicing. But when the Dáil met to scrutinize the terms, though some delegates welcomed what the treaty gave them, others saw it as a betrayal of the Republican ideal. Eventually, after an acrimonious debate, the treaty was ratified by a small majority. Sinn Fein, too, had been a coalition. Now the strain of keeping moderates and extremists together was proving too great. Their ways parted. The British got ready to go home. Civil servants burnt their files, packed their bags, and left Dublin Castle for the last time. The prisoners they still held were released from jail. The towns were paid off and demobbed. At formal military ceremonies, the British handed over. The Irish Free State was born. The British Army began to evacuate Ireland. The troops, happy to be finished with the job they'd come to loathe, marched through the streets, cheered and applauded by people who were glad to see them go. The British Army of Occupation in Ireland embarked for India, Egypt, Palestine, Cyprus, and other British responsibilities overseas. But Ireland's troubles were not ended. The worst was to come.